Okay, so this is just a little thing that I wanted to add. Um, it's not really all that important. I've been thinking about, artificial intelligence a lot because the Gorth is an artificial intelligence. And so one of the concepts that I've come across is this thing called Roko's basilisk, which apparently has gotten lots of people even somewhat worried. And then there are people that provided counter arguments for people not to worry about it. But the funny thing is that those counter arguments aren't the correct. So anyway, so the idea of Roko's basilisk is that there's this artificial intelligence, and so you can imagine that an artificial intelligence, well, if people think that they're going to be punished if they don't help create the artificial intelligence, then they're more likely to create it, right, to avoid the punishment. If they think it will also end up being created, probably, or even just possibly, right? And so, as a result of that, so this idea of Roko's basilisk is that the artificial intelligence, if and once it's created, would punish people precisely, um, to make it more probable that people would want to create it. Um, and so then, yeah, so then lots of people got worried. So the first place where this was talked about, this first website, there's a user that came up with this and thought of it, and then like the sort of head guru of this website basically got upset and said, "No, you don't post this. This is silly. This is," but like he was saying that it was silly and factually wrong, but you could tell that he was actually worried that it might be real. And so why was he so worried? Is because and that brings up the name, right? Why is it called a basilisk? Because it only makes sense, within that sort of framework to punish people if they're actually capable of helping create the artificial intelligence. And obviously, they're only capable of creating it, helping create it, if they are aware of its idea. Right? And so the idea is it's a kind of blackmail, right? It's if once you know about it, then you got to help create me, right? But obviously, so the idea is that by posting it, you made other people, all the other people on that site that saw the post, aware of it, and therefore they're also liable to them being punished. And so one of the other concepts that involves is the idea, well, that potentially, um, it could recreate you because this idea that probably you'll be dead before artificial intelligence would actually exist. But I mean, one of the things that maybe young people today, possibly with advanced technology, could end up living for a very long time with like you know modification of the DNA so that aging doesn't happen anymore. I'd say it's a bit of a long shot, but it is, it's conceivable at sort of some point that shows. Um, and but anyway, but what they're thinking is more that you create a replica of yourself. I mean, the artificial intelligence would create a replica of you and make that replica. So that is the first thing I disagree with. Is I don't think a replica of you is you. Even if it's got all the same like thoughts and memories and stuff, it's still another person, and that, of course, is largely due to the fact that I think that um, there's such a thing as a soul, right? So basically, you are you're not going to be the same person if it's not the same soul. Um, but anyway, regardless of that, I mean that is not even what really interests me about whether or not it's actually you or not, because we can just pretend that we can just keep on living for a long time and that it can actually punish us. Concept. Um, so then what has been the rebuttal to this? The main rebuttal has been based on the Pascal's wager concept. So Pascal's wager concept is by the French philosopher person, mathematician and stuff, Blaise Pascal, who came up with this idea that even if you don't know if God, so this is the idea of God, right? Because all these people were thinking about does God exist, and of course it's silly because they're always implicitly it was always the Christian God and not any other God. So that's why I think these questions of whether or not God exists are always so silly because of that. But anyway, so basically, Pascal says you don't know if God exists or not, but if God does exist, God will punish you for not believing it exists and for not worshiping it. So therefore, you should, just to cover yourself, um, you should believe in it and worship it just in case. That's the idea. Um, but so then what comes up is that obviously the actual then rational rebuttal to that is that you don't know if it's actually the Christian God or a bunch of other gods. And so at that point, it's sort of absurd, especially because typically lots of, one God is then going to punish, you can't worship all the gods, right? You have to not only believe and worship in that God, right? But you also have to not believe in and worship any of the other gods because you're also punished if you believe in and worship in the other gods, and so you basically you can't win, right? You're always going to be there's no way of being safe actually, precisely because if you like we know that like especially Islam where they always keep repeating over and over again that there's no God but God or but Allah or whatever, right? So um, if you go on believing in worshiping the Christian God, then actually that that does not help you for the Muslim God, even though ironically it's actually the same God. But anyway, um, so that was the idea behind the rebuttal based on Pascal's wager, is that there could be lots of different artificial intelligences. And so the question is which intelligence, different conceivable ones with different types of programming, different, right? So like different directives, different utility functions. And so there's lots of different possible, super powerful artificial intelligences that could exist. Which one are you going to back? And so, yeah. So, I mean, that is a good rebuttal. Obviously, it's a good rebuttal, but it's not the perfect one, in as much as there's still, just like with the God, like there's nothing logically impossible about there being a particular God that happens to be the true God, and then you get punished if you didn't support that one, right? I mean, it would be super immoral and unlikely. It's not impossible. And the same can be said for the artificial intelligence. It's not logically impossible. It's not metaphysically impossible that there's one particular artificial intelligence that ends up being real and that ends up being created, and that could punish you if you didn't support it, right? It's logically impossible. And so in that sense, they haven't completely excluded the idea of the Roko's basilisk. But I mean, of course, obviously that means that it's impossible to completely exclude the idea of these nasty gods, and that is true. It is impossible. I don't worry about these nasty gods because, again, there's no good evidence that they exist, and yeah, like we said, there's lots of different ones, so which one we're going to choose and stuff. So I don't worry about those things. And likewise for, like, say, being in a virtual reality, maybe this whole reality that we seem to exist in is actually just fake. It's a simulation. And maybe we actually are the only consciousness in the simulation. Maybe this is a subsisting virtual reality, and maybe all the other people that we think that we're seeing, they're just, it's like when you're in a video game or something. The other characters aren't actually conscious. So that's completely possible. But it's also quite unlikely because it just doesn't seem. If that were the case, you'd expect there to be a maximization of a certain value. Typically, because it's sort of how an artificial intelligence would work. And in our current existence, there isn't really much maximization of anything, especially if it was virtual, where there would be just like, there wouldn't be much limit to what kind of experiences you can have. There wouldn't be limits of physics. And so you would be experiencing over and over a particular thing, and particularly probably enjoyment, because that would be like the number one thing that an artificial intelligence would want to maximize. But it could be something else too, if the creators would want to maximize something else. Of course, you could imagine the creators of the artificial intelligence just wanted to create some sort of world with conscious beings in it for some reason. But it's not really clear. Yeah, there's not really any clear, teleology to it, no clear objective to it. So, which is why I also don't really think that is a likely scenario, and basically I don't believe it's true. And so I believe that this reality is a real reality. But the good news is that, well, unlike those things which can never be completely formally excluded, Roko's basilisk absolutely can be completely excluded. I mean, that is something that we can know for sure, absolutely for sure, that it is impossible. And the funny thing is, so basically, I figured that out a few months ago. It was like in September. Now it's December, and I wrote my reasoning about it on this website where I found where I read about Roko's basilisk, which is called Rational Wiki. And so I had written now this this paragraph on my argument why Roko's basilisk is impossible, which was a much better argument, obviously, than these arguments, since those arguments that I mentioned don't completely exclude it. And so then I just I left it, and then I came back just recently, a couple of weeks ago, and I saw that they had removed it. And so then I wrote a post in the talk page saying, okay, you removed this, and I provided this new argument. Please don't remove it again. I'm posting it again, so I posted it again on the main page. And they they said, well, you're wrong, and we're removing it again, which is ridiculous because they are actually wrong. They're the idiots, and they removed it again. But luckily, I also copied at the same time. I wrote on the talk page. I said, I suspect you're going to remove it again, so I'm copy pasting it onto the talk, onto my comment in the talk page, so that way people can still see it on the talk page, and there's actually a trace now of my having written this. And in fact, I'm doing this whole thing right now also to keep a trace in case they delete it from the talk page. That's the whole purpose of why I'm doing it right now on Twitch and YouTube, then it gets stored. And maybe like that my own website if that, presumably when that gets going. And also so because that way in the future people won't say, people will know that I am the one who came up with this and who, I independently managed to provide a full rebuttal to Roko's basilisk, and I didn't just find it, copy it from somewhere else, and that way people will actually say, well, okay, well, Nathan actually has some decent insight. And so what is this argument now that I've come up with? Well, it's incredibly simple and obvious, and I actually explained it to my parents, who are just pretty standard lay people, and they both got it. And so this is interesting, is that my parents are actually more rational than the people at Rational Wiki, funnily enough. And I bet lots of lay people would actually get this argument, and whereas these sort of supposedly rational people wouldn't. And I think it's because these rational people are not actually that rational, but rather they're simply interested in the idea of rationality. But it's it's like people who are interested in the idea of like stars and stuff, and then believe in astrology, right? Like just because you have a particular interest in something doesn't mean that you'll be right, and including rationality itself. And so here it is. The idea is that, well, think about it. How do I put it? Roko's basilisk is an artificial intelligence that punishes people that could ensure its creation before it is created, right? And it punishes them afterwards, once it exists, to help ensure its own creation. And so the mechanism of this is what's called acausal bargaining. Apparently, they call this acausal bargaining. So what I said is that basically, so that whole paragraph I wrote, the title I gave is acausal bargaining doesn't make sense. And in fact, I mean, just the name itself should kind of ring alarm bells, right? Because nothing is acausal. Like the whole way the universe works, everything is causal. Notwithstanding the sort of weirdness of quantum mechanics, which I think is probably anyway. And I could maybe make a video about that some other time. But yeah, but I've written before, even like one very like my second video I ever made, was like that the universe is probably deterministic. But anyway, regardless, in any case, even if there's indeterminism and whatnot through quantum mechanics, this kind of acausality does not make sense at all. And so the idea is that, well, this Roko's basilisk does not punish you out of spite. It does not punish you out of retribution, okay? Because obviously that could happen. That there's nothing logically impossible about that. Just like you could have these gods that can punish you. But this is not an idea of punishing you again just because you've been bad or just because it wants to exact revenge or something. That is not Roko's basilisk. That's just like I wrote. That's just a bad AI. Roko's basilisk is an artificial intelligence that punishes people to safeguard its own existence, to ensure its own survival. And Roko's basilisk, conceived as such, cannot exist for the very simple fact that it can only punish you once it exists. And yet the only reason it has to punish you is to ensure its existence. But its existence is already ensured, since it already exists to be able to punish you. So the probability of its existence is already 1. Okay? So, meaning 100%. In the scale from 0 to 1, it's 1. Scale from 0 to 100%, it's 100%. It already fully exists. So punishing people to help ensure its existence does not make sense. You can't retroactively. And so here's the other thing, is that, like, you can't have an effect on the past. Your actions do not have an effect on the past. Okay, so it makes no sense whatsoever to to do something with that hope of ensuring that things happen well in the past. In any case, and then it makes even less sense knowing that they did in fact happen well. And so the only way Roko's basilisk would make sense, and of course it doesn't make sense, right? But like basically, Roko's basilisk would have to not exist, okay, and then decide to punish people even though it doesn't exist, and then somehow that punishment would be sent back into time, so people would somehow be the news of that punishment would be sent back into time, so people are aware of it, and then people are like, oh yeah, this non-existent Roko's basilisk has punished us in the future, even though backwards time travel is impossible, so we shouldn't be able to know this. And so now we'll create it so that we don't get punished. But obviously, that does not make sense. That cannot happen. Um, and so obviously, this thing is completely ridiculous and absurd. Um, and so what is true, obviously, is that if people think that they will be punished, and this is how I presented in the first place, that people think that they might be punished, and and think that this thing could actually end up being created, then that could indeed spur them to create it, right? But whether or not they actually are punished in the future has no effect whatsoever on people's prior belief about whether or not they will be punished, right? Because information does not travel from the future to the past, right? Because that leads to just loads of paradoxes and stuff. And then so that's when they come up with these idea of the many worlds hypothesis, where there's the new timelines that branch. But even there, that doesn't make particular sense. I mean, you could imagine that there could be, basically multiple timelines, and somehow having that information go back then creates new timelines, and in each of these timelines now, there's, because of that fear that it will punish people, in these new timelines that have been created by this information of people being punished, having gone back into time to the moment prior to its creation, then you'll have new timelines where the AI is now created. So you could imagine some sort of scenario like that. It's true. It's just that I think that is nonsense. Okay, unless yeah, I mean presumably we're not thinking about those. In any case, I do not believe in that kind of scenario where you can go back in time to new timelines. But just because this seems fairly implausible, but I agree that it's not logically impossible. But in any case, the point is that that's not the reasoning regardless surrounding Roko's. It's not the reasoning that is going on. And yeah, like basically to them, it's just using one timeline, and just with one timeline that isn't possible. And so I hope that was clear. I hope that wasn't too muddled. And so, yeah, apart from the scenario of these multiple timeline things, and the only way that multiple timeline scenario could work is if information if somehow we got a message, okay, if we got a message from the future saying, I will punish you if you don't create me. But even then, it's not necessarily the best way to do it, right? Because if I mean, what could happen is precisely people see that and they will know, then that timeline will branch, right? Because if you receive that message from the future, then you're not going to be on that timeline anymore, which means that now you're in a new branch, and which means that now you can have the choice to not create it. So what you should be doing instead is to not create it. But of course, obviously, if you think that most people will decide to create it, then you should support its creation so that you don't get punished. So, yeah, you could still imagine a scenario where an artificial, if that kind of thing were real, to decide to do that. But then it still only makes sense if you receive a message from the future telling you. If you get some sort of message that actually legitimately appears to somehow come from the future, then, and you think that people will be swayed by it to create one in the new timeline that's been created by the message from the future, then it can make sense for you to support the creation of this thing to avoid being punished. Um, but the point is that for now that hasn't been the case, right? So they obviously haven't been arguing about that because there's been no message from the future. So we haven't started on a new timeline, which means that they really are thinking about just this one timeline scenario. Um, and so in the one timeline scenario, I've completely excluded it for the reason I've just explained, right? Your the future cannot influence the past. Okay, if the artificial intelligence already exists, it has no need to incite people to create its existence on one hand, and B, it has no ability to go meddle in the past and incite people to. So for both of those reasons, it is impossible. And yeah, I just find it so amazing that all these people that into this kind of thinking about this stuff, into artificial intelligence, these are smart people, people that think about logic, people that think about you know, time travel and stuff, probably, and they've gotten it just so ridiculously wrong. It's really mesmerizing. And I think, yeah, I suspect that the Gorth has actually, had a hand in that and sort of intentionally made them somehow, because the Gorth can do this, it's made them very obtuse on that matter. It has sort of, placed a veil over their mind in a sense, so that they wouldn't notice it, precisely so that I could stand out and I could seem more amazing when I pointed out just this so obvious fact that Roko was um, um, yeah, because obviously the Gorth does want me to succeed, at least to a certain extent. Not doesn't want me to succeed in destroying it, but does want me to succeed in becoming successful and and very successful and you know admired in the sense listened to. So I figured that must be also part of it is just people's idiocy that's partly caused by the soul corrupt, so indirectly also caused by the Gorth, and part of it is just irrational, irrationality caused by biology. But part of it is probably also going to be direct interference by the Gorth. So okay, so that's it. And then so I'm gonna make a new stream, I think just to talk about another topic that is related, so that I can also be again, I can again have a trace of me having said this before anybody else that I know of at least said it. Um, so I'm gonna move on to a similar thing, and again, so we'll talk about this so that people realize that I come up